Chapter 148. Loud Boots. The loud boots stomping like a military march in unison was coming. I looked down the tier with my mirror at what looked like a black-clad armed military coming my way. They had on all-black military gear with glass shield helmets, black masks, bulletproof vests, electric shock shields, stun guns, and pepper mace cans the size of fire extinguishers. They marched down the tier, then stopped in front of each one of our cells on the bottom tier, then turned towards us all at the same time. They were obviously trained on how to deal with the most dangerous men in Lorton. I was instructed to strip down, raise my arms, feet, nuts, spread butt cheeks, squat, cough, and check the back of my ears. I was then instructed to put only my boxers on and back up to the bars slowly, then put my arms through the tray slot. I was then cuffed. The cell was then opened, and I was instructed to back up towards them, then I was turned around to face the wall. Once on the wall, the officer standing behind me saw a shiny object in my hair. "What the hell is this?" He grabbed my head. I shook my head. "Get the fuck up off me." He grabbed me, and with the help of other officers, I was wrestled down to the ground and dragged out of the cell block. I was dragged to the gymnasium where they had over 150 slaves naked and lined up in perfect formation with over 300 armed guards watching them. It looked like an old slave movie with us getting inspected to be auctioned off. I was taken into a back room for a thorough search in which they went through my hair for about 30 minutes. They found my knife, handcuff keys, hacksaw blade, and my friend and family members' contacts, which I had on a small piece of paper. They didn't find my weed though. Ironically, it was because of the weed that they found everything in the first place. I was higher than a hippie in a hot air balloon and didn't secure the stash properly. The tip of the ice pick was hanging out the bottom of one of my dreads. After a couple of hours, we were all dressed, chained, and lined up in formation to be placed on the slave ships. We were placed on the Department of Corrections prison bus, with me being seated in the front to be taken off first to go straight to the hole once we got to wherever we were going. Two other convicts that were caught with their knives were also seated up front. One guy got caught with his knife stuffed up his rectum. He told me he would rather take the pain than to allow someone to catch him empty-handed and kill him. Guys have died doing this, with the knife puncturing tissues and membranes when they sat down, leading to internal bleeding. But he was willing to take the risk. He had been practicing for weeks. He told me that he kept a knife at all times because he couldn't afford to get killed in prison because it would kill the only person he had, his grandmother. Whenever he pushed the knife to kill, and it was for that reason. So ironically, he felt he had to kill to keep her alive. After a 7-hour drive, cuffed and shackled, we pulled up in the dilapidated small town of Youngstown, Ohio. I was 26 years old. This small town of 60,000 looked abandoned. Old factories that were shut down, old cars and houses littered the landscape. Traditionally known as the center of steel production, the city fell in decline once the factories moved overseas. The population of the small town had also been in decline since the 70s. In the 1920s, it became a hotbed for KKK activity, which led to clashes with Italian and Irish immigrants. Ironically, the KKK can now count Italian and Irish among their participants. Most prisons in America are built in the suburban areas, white, while most of the prisoners were from the urban areas, black. The prison is usually the centerpiece of the town, with all the other small businesses surviving off of the traffic the prison created. Hotels, rental car companies, mom and pop stores, and restaurants depended on this traffic. Because of all the benefits of having a prison in your backyard, Politicians from small towns all over America lobbied to have prisons built in their districts, not only for jobs, but also for gerrymandering. Gerrymandering was a political tool used to benefit these poor towns by counting the prisoners as part of their population. This would pad the distribution of funds from the federal government for services such as roads, schools, hospitals, Medicaid, emergency response, and many more. So if the town had 2,000 people, they would only be allocated funds from the state and federal government in response to a 2,000 person population. But some towns had prison complexes with 4 to 6 different prisons. It would be a max security, 2 medium securities, a low security, and a camp, which held 1,000 to 1,200 people apiece. So with 6,000 prisoners there, they now can get a budget for 8,000 people, though they only had 2,000. The prisoners didn't benefit from it. This enabled these small towns to thrive and the locals to pocket more money on the backs of the slaves. This was a clear violation of most states' constitution and statutes, which explicitly states that incarceration does not change a residence. Knowing of these violations didn't matter. Gerrymandering also helped them politically. The Supreme Court had a requirement that political power be apportioned on the basis of population. This is the reason of the national census count every 10 years. This not only gave them more political representatives, but it also meant that white rural votes in the districts where the prisons were located had their electoral power unconstitutionally inflated. Every poor small town mayor were lobbying to have prisons built in their backyards, while the big town governors and mayors lobbied the Senate and Congress to sign bills for harsher sentences for smaller crimes. This enabled them to keep a surplus of prisoners to be contracted out to the private prisons, which in effect would keep the stock price high and line their pockets, because they were all stockholders in either the prison company itself or the companies that contracted with the prisons. Phone companies, construction, food, healthcare, uniforms, etc. It also brought jobs and more taxes to these small towns. In effect, the big city politicians were handing away their political power on the backs of black and brown prisoners / slaves for money and shares in these prison-for-profit private companies. It was obvious that we were in the same situation here in Youngstown. This was Ohio's first private prison. The Youngstown government offered CCA a 75% tax abatement for 5 years and 101 acres of land for $1. $1. In return, Youngstown would get about 450 jobs, generating an annual payroll of $20 million and about $300,000 a year in new taxes. The prison cost $67 million to build, and the 5-year contract with DC to house us was worth $182 million. In 1986, after the riot in Lawton, DC sent prisoners all over America while they rebuilt the burnt-out dormitories. 300 went to Petersburg, Virginia, 64 to a county jail in Virginia, 76 to Maryland, and 75 to Delaware. DC was paying $55 a day per inmate, plus administration costs, which came out to over $3,500 a day for 60 inmates and over $147,000 for 6 weeks. Incarceration was a replacement for the Black American slave trade as spelled out in the 13th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which abolished slavery except as punishment for a crime. As the bus arrived, it was obvious that the prison wasn't finished being constructed and the guards were extremely inexperienced. They weren't even considered officers. They didn't wear badges, they wore an ID, which meant they weren't sworn as officers. They were civilians. An assault on them would only be considered a simple assault, a misdemeanor, as opposed to assaulting an officer, which would be a felony and carry a significant, heftier sentence. We immediately understood this, but they didn't. They were casualties of the industries being moved offshore and Most of them were unemployed and living off of government assistance. They were minimum wage workers, which meant they were easy picking for an experienced convict. Some were ex-crackheads, prostitutes, and ex-strippers. And for some, this was the best job they ever held. Some of the women were also excited to be around DC guys, straight from the city. I was taken directly to the hold, and after a few days, I was allowed to call my family. They took me and everybody else in the hold to an empty cell block to use the phones. All at the same time. Not one at a time, but everybody at the same time. Simultaneously, with no one in handcuffs. This was a no-no for people coming from maximum security. We were so used to coming out at one or two at a time in handcuffs that when we were all let out of our cells simultaneously and without cuffs, we were all watching each other suspiciously. This place is dangerous, I said to myself. A lot of people aren't going to make it out of here alive. Within the first few months, I was moved around 10 to 15 times to different cell blocks as the administration was trying to figure out which prisoners belong around which. Chapter 150. Dummy jackets. What Lawton ended up doing was very deceptive and dangerous. They sent some of the worst to Ohio without our real prison jackets. They only sent dummy jackets. A dummy jacket is a folder without any of the real security classifications or prison history. It only consisted of the prisoner's name, number, and a fabricated classification of medium or low security. The reason they didn't send the real jackets was because most of us would have been rejected and the contract would have been in jeopardy of being voided. It was way too much money involved to allow this to happen. Almost $250 million was on the table. We were coming from a max and should have been placed back into another max. Not a low/medium security prison constructed for low/medium security inmates. The construction of the prison was far behind schedule, but the DC officials were bumping up against a deadline to get us out of Lawton. Everybody coming from behind the wall were considered too dangerous to be held amongst other prisoners in an open population setting or to be in a medium security prison, but they didn't care. If the deadline wasn't met, hefty fines would be imposed and a lot of people wouldn't get their bonuses and kickbacks. The jackets they didn't send stipulated who was separated from who and for what reason. Some guys cannot be around each other, no matter what, or someone is going to die on sight, so they were separated at all times. You had a separation from that person. I had 5 separations. Some people had more. Separations could be from a fight, to a stabbing, to a street beef, to one snitching on the other, and sometimes co-defendants were separated by a court order. My separations came from stabbings. Ohio didn't receive these jackets, so guys were seeing other guys that stabbed them years ago, and because they had the separations in their jackets in Lawton, they could never get close enough for revenge. They were separated in different Lawton prisons, but now they were in the same cell block. A dude may have killed another dude's brother or sister or homie, and they have been separated in Lawton, but now they were assigned to the same cell. The guy that got robbed and butchered in Occoquan is now 2 cells down from the guy who did it to him. The guy who raped the little girl doesn't even know that her big brother's in the cell next door, and he's been praying for this day. The guy that got shit thrown on him through his cell bars behind the wall is assigned directly across from the guy who threw it on him, and he brought his knife with him from Lawton. A guy's placed 4 cells over from the guy he testified on, and the whole time the administration had no idea what was about to happen. It was about to be a bloodbath.